Okay, so this week our question number 3 is there a critical period for second language acquisition? Now, notice that this is not, is there a critical period? Because it's less controversial to say that one exists, but is there one for second language acquisition? So let's go ahead and begin with this question. What is a critical period? It's a pretty important precursor to having this conversation because to say that something exists or not, we have to have a pretty clear idea of what that means, okay? So my first question is, what is a critical period for first language acquisition? What is a critical period? And a critical period is generally defined as like a sensitive period, a period in which you can acquire a skill into, let's call it a native-like way. Um, for first language acquisition, the critical period is the idea is there's a period where you can acquire human language, and if you don't learn human language by the end of that time period, that age, let's say, that after that you can't learn a first language in a way that's anything like a native speaker. So if you extend that to second language acquisition, the idea would be that assuming you've learned a first language, is there an age after which you cannot acquire a second language as if it were a first? Okay. And there's various ways to answer this question, but that's the idea. Now, a question to kind of understand where this is coming from is to ask, are there other critical periods? And the answer is yes, actually. Um, and some of them are analogous, like birdsong, which is funny because we're going to talk about an author today named Birdsong, but I mean the song that birds sing in this case. So in this moment, talking about the song the birds sing, not a person. Birds, if they're not exposed to their native bird song by a certain age, don't learn the songs that pertain to their particular type of bird, right? A dove who doesn't get exposed to other doves singing before a certain age never sings in a way that most doves would recognize as a dove. And this is the kind of idea. This comes from biology, right? Um, because it's a biological mechanism to have critical periods. In fact, it pertains to a lot of different biological functions, such as language. And if you haven't already realized language is a biological function, it is, right? Um, but, things like eyesight actually are also biological functions. There was a study, and I don't know who did it off the top of my head, but I've read about it, in which they deprived, I'm not going to tell you what animal it is because it makes it sad, but a particular animal type of sight by it was either covering their eyes or something slightly more terrible, but deprived them of sight during their youth up to a certain age. And then they took away the impediment once they hit a certain, whatever that age would be, what would be the end of a perceived critical period. And these animals never really acquired the ability to process visual data, right? So if you gain the ability of sight after the critical period for sight, you can't really see, even if your eyes can absorb the light suddenly. Your brain can't process it, right? There is a biological relationship with the mind when it comes to these sorts of things. There's cases with people who've lived their whole lives, humans, um, with visual impairments, blindness of some form, because there's lots of kinds, obviously. Um, and there's at least a couple cases where they were restored what would be somewhat normal sight in adulthood, and these people were extremely disoriented, and they weren't allowed, they felt like they weren't supposed to be using their canes anymore, and that was awful for them too, but their brain couldn't really handle it because it's not built that way anymore. And so that's what a critical period is. It is a time period in which our brain can learn to use information, right? And if we miss it, our mind's not really adapted to use that information anymore. And so we're proposing, at least for first language acquisition, that what happens is that after a particular age, you haven't already acquired language, the biological function that allows us to be native speakers of things just never really clicks, right? And so for that extended second language is actually It's a curiosity because it's not really biological anymore, okay? So here, for your later studying, a critical period is defined as if you're after the critical period, right? So it would be you suddenly have an unavailability of biologically endowed learning mechanisms. So during the critical period, before you hit that certain age, you would have these biologically endowed learning mechanisms. And then after it, which is what we're usually referring to when we say there is one, we're talking about being after it. Suddenly those biological mechanisms are not available. And in this case, children, for example, can't really proceed, language acquisition can't proceed like child L1 acquisition. That includes for children. Originally, it was proposed for L1 acquisition starting at puberty. So for children, it was proposed to apply at the critical period was going to end at puberty. And Lenberg here from 1967 is the first person to put it in those terms based on clinical data. There are famous case studies of people who were found afterwards. The most famous case is a girl who I don't know if she goes by Jeannie or is named Jeannie, which first time I heard about this, I'm like, was half listening, and my teacher's like, in the case of Jeannie, and and then I realized it wasn't me. But this is the most famous case, and typically when we're face to face, I'll ask the class, what happened in the case of Jeannie? And so I'll have to tell you since we're not face to face. But Jeannie was a girl who was discovered in the 70s at the age of 13, having been deprived of language for most of her life. She was a child who had suffered abuse and neglect. She had been enclosed in essentially a basement or a large closet, I don't recall which. And the only seat that she had in that space was a potty chair that she was supposed to be using, but she had developed a callus in the shape of the potty chair. Like, it was abuse, like, genuinely. And as a result, she neglected to get really any input in any language. It was in America, so it would have been English. And so Jeannie, at the age of 13, then began being exposed to language, English, as I said, and never really acquired it. Eventually, she learned some lexical items. She tended to sign, but it didn't have any syntactic structure, so you can't call it ASL, right? But the lexical items that she learned would have pertained to ASL. But yeah, and so the idea is that Jeannie got discovered after the critical period had ended, right? So suddenly she didn't have available to her these biologically endowed learning mechanisms, right? A way of thinking about it is saying she no longer had UG. That's how we would probably refer to it. And again, it depends on whether you're going to claim UG or not. But for the moment, let's just stick with that story. So anyway, her biological learning mechanisms were off. Lenberg, the reason why he wrote about it 10 years before this, because 1978 is the book about Jeannie, right? And Lenberg was talking about it. He's talking about his clinical cases. A lot of them had to do with aphasias. If you take Signs of Language in the Brain, which is one of our courses in the spring, you'll learn that aphasia is a really big piece of the puzzle in understanding how language works in the mind. And what happens with aphasias in children is if you have like a brain injury, for example, you can lose the ability to use language for a while as a child, but children recover, right? Adults, however, do not. If you hit them in the right part of their brain and they lose language, and again, there's a bunch of types of aphasia. I'm oversimplifying, but this is the idea. If you lose some piece or major part of your language, adults don't recover like children do, right? If you hit someone right in the hippocampus with a really hard ball, I don't know, something, they don't tend to recover. And the idea was that had to do with the mind and the brain. Well, the brain, not the mind, the brain. Lenberg in particular was claiming that at the onset of puberty, so 13-ish, right when Jeannie was found, that the brain lateralizes. Now, lateralization is a process where functions go to one side or the other. And he's proposing that up until that point, children are using most of their brain to do language, right? To process, to whatever. And then at puberty, most of that function goes to one hemisphere, the left hemisphere where the hippocampus is. And what he was suggesting is that during the critical period, so before you hit that puberty spot, you have the ability to reassign different parts of your brain to do language. And he's saying that once you've lateralized, you don't have that option anymore. right? So he's arguing these biologically endowed mechanisms reflect stuff that's going on in the structure of the brain as well. Now, as for second language acquisition, there are three positions, as always. Is there a critical period for second language acquisition? And one position is yes, there is one. And I think most of us tend to assume this is the case. There's, of course, is no, there isn't one. And then there is, but for some parts of language, right? We'll get there. So position one is yes. There is a specific drop-off point after which it's much, much harder to learn. So in Lundberg's original formulation, that would be 13, and that's why, well, that was L1 acquisition. So the question is, would it be the same if it exists for adults and stuff like that? But it's important that this formulation says there is a specific drop-off point, right? Because if it's a biologically endowed time period, you ought to get to a point where suddenly you don't have access to it anymore, right? For some reason, I like the sound effect or whatever, some kind of noise, because the idea is you're chugging along normal and then it's gone, right? This is the idea most people who argue about the critical period have in their mind. It's a somewhat specific drop-off point, okay? So a person who says that there is not a critical period says there's not a specific drop-off point. However, even if you say there's no critical period, most people will not argue that there's at least a gradual drop-off, okay? Where it seems like when you're a kid, you're doing great, you start to hit puberty, second languages, this is L2. Second languages get a little bit, they're not quite like small children, then adulthood's a little harder, and okay. So the claim about a critical period for L2, if you say no, has to do with there isn't a specific drop-off, but there can be a slow decline. That distinction may seem to you non-meaningful, but I'll tell you why, okay? And so here it says apparent age-related effects are not due to biologically endowed mechanisms, okay? So we'll see that. And then the third position, as I said, is there is a critical period for some things. This position is compatible with an argument where there's one for phonology, totally, and then there isn't one for other things. So if you're thinking that direction, position 3 is where you're headed, okay? But let's talk a little bit about drop-off points. So this is a hypothetical pair of curves, right? I believe that I made this. I think so. It's, I've taught this class a couple of years. But so here, I've plotted along the bottom something like, imagine this is age of acquisition. How old are you when you start learning a language? And if there is an age and an accuracy, which is to say, if I were to measure someone out of 100%, behaving totally like a native speaker, whatever that means. Let's just imagine that's possible. That's what my y-axis is. Behavior like a accuracy on a measure that makes you behave like a native speaker or a monolingual or whatever. Now, what we're comparing when I say, is there a drop-off point, is something kind of like the light blue line and the dark blue line. Now, it doesn't seem like an important distinction, but it is, right? Notice that the light blue line has kind of a curve, right? It's going, it's a little hard, a little hard, a little hard, a little hard, a little harder. I don't know. Whereas the dark blue line, the drop-off line, goes, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm going to go, poof, actually, I'm not good, sorry, That would be what we would expect to see if there truly is a critical period. The brain lateralizing at 13, like what you're seeing right here. And as far as we know with first language acquisition, this is kind of what we're seeing, right? Jeannie was found at 13. And she really couldn't learn language, not syntactically, certainly. She could give you like lexical items, but she really couldn't make sentences or full complicated thoughts, right? Okay, so this is why I'm asking this question, is that these two things are different, and the dark blue one is what we seem to see for monolinguals, for L1, for child. And the light blue would be the other possibility. Now, if someone says there is a critical period, let's talk about the strong version, right? That there's a sudden drop-off in attainment or performance by age of acquisition. Johnson and Newport, 1989, who appears on the homework for this section, Actually, I put it into the skills quiz, so some nice matchup. Anyway, Johnson Newport 1989 would say that yes, there is a critical period, and this comes from their study. Now, sudden drop off becomes a little bit subjective, right? But let's say here, what you're seeing is mean score on the y-axis here, and this is a score that they would expect a monolingual to perform 270 out of 270 on, okay? This is an English grammar test. The participants are native speakers of Asian languages, I believe Korean and Chinese. And then across the x-axis, we're seeing buckets, right? And buckets are when you have a couple numbers in one category, right? Buckets of ages of arrival, because Johnson and Newport used age of arrival to the United States as age of acquisition. And there's a couple reasons to consider doing that, but that's sort of outside of what I'm discussing right now. Now, Johnson and Newport, from this graph and this set of data, claim that there is a critical period. But what they're showing here, to my eye, is not exactly sudden, right? And it starts earlier to some degree than what Lenberg was suggesting. This is L2, right? You're going, it's kind of early, right? And also, if it's out of 270, the top age group is still 210. So are they really doing poor? I don't know. I don't know. But this is a very often cited study. It's one of the first ones to say, oh yeah, there's a critical period, right? Other people who agreed with this assessment, using their own data, have also made claims such as, there must be a critical period for L2 acquisition because too many non-natives just don't reach native likeness. Okay. I mean, that doesn't tell us why, but this is a claim that's made, right? And these authors, Robert De Keyser, and Diane Larson Hall, by this point I know their full names anymore. The authors, these two, argue that the children are relying on implicit learning mechanisms where adults are relying on explicit learning mechanisms, which is why implicit versus explicit has been a question asked by many people. Okay, so this is one of the reasons for there's a critical period. Another model that's consistent specifically with this implicit explicit is the declarative procedural model, which appears in the theory section of our book, pages 67 to 70. So this again would say that implicit versus explicit are different methods of learning, and that children have a tendency to be implicit, adults have a tendency to be explicit. It's called declarative for explicit and procedural for implicit in this particular model, but it's the same idea. Another thing in this bucket is the fundamental difference hypothesis, which isn't looking at drop-off points, but it is, like De Keyser and Larson Hall, talking about outcomes. What Blave Roman, I believe his name is Robert. No, I don't remember. Anyway, what he's claiming is that there's no universals in second language, even though they are in first language. And in fact, what he's saying is there's no UG in L2, but there is UG in L1. Okay, that's literally what he's claiming. And so how did he come to this conclusion? What he did is he looked at these generalizations that he drew about L1 and L2 acquisition. So he claims L1 acquisition is generally successful, it has a consistent outcome, instructions are relevant, it doesn't need negative evidence. Negative evidence is evidence that something is wrong. So maybe like, oh, don't say that, that's not English, right? And that there's no effective individual factors such as personality, motivation, and attitude. Okay, this is what Blave Roman says about L1, whereas he claims for L2 there's a general lack of success. Okay, inconsistent outcome among learners. That I more agree with. Okay, instruction is important. Depends on who you ask. That it needs negative evidence, he claims, and that it's affected by individual factors such as personality, motivation, and attitude. Okay, so these are Blave Roman's generalizations, right? And so he's looking at things in terms of internal versus external. So if you take a look at that external factors in particular seem to affect L2 according to Blave Roman, such as when he says negative evidence and instruction and individual factors, which are frankly internal, but He's saying that the fact that L2 is so differential in outcome and that to his eye external factors matter, right? He says that ergo the biological function, and in his case specifically UG, must not be active, he says, okay? Now so that's where this particular so these are for studying later, right? He concluded L2 is affected by external factors, L2 isn't, such as these things. And so he proposed that being subject to external factors are due to a lack of UG. Now, some things that I have that are issues with this, personally. First of all, are we convinced this is true of all L2 learners? Are there L2 learners that become native-like? Arguably, yes. Are there L2 learners that do not need instruction? Yes, right? In fact, some of the most successful L2 learners are never really in a classroom. That should give you pause, right? So there's that, right? So he says instruction is important, and he says that you need negative evidence, and he says that it's affected by individual factors. Honestly, the role of instruction is debatable, and we're going to talk about it in question 8. It's debatable, and by debatable it means maybe, maybe not. So we can't take that as a blanket evidence. And there's evidence of some things being acquirable without being told that it's wrong. Like you can, if you look right here, someone wrote about this. Okay. You know, some of my research in particular deals with can you acquire things that can you acquire the knowledge of something is bad without any evidence that it's bad? And how do you distinguish something that's bad and therefore you never hear it, right? From something that's good and it's just so infrequent you still don't hear it. And people who are high level proficiency in English, for example, still differentiate these things. So it's not the case from my research, I would say, and other people's, that negative evidence is actually necessary. So keep that in mind. But yes, individual differences do seem to exist to some degree, and they seem to have a factor in L2 acquisition to some degree. And we'll come back to that in question 7. So yes and no, right? I'm not totally on board with Blave Roman, but I do see a little bit of what he's talking about. I agree that the outcome is inconsistent. I agree that individual factors appear to be a thing. But instruction and negative evidence, I'm not really on the same page with him about that one. More importantly, this hypothesis, FDH or fundamental difference hypothesis, concludes that being affected by external being affected by external factors is evidence of lack of access to UG. And why? I don't know why that is inherently the case. I don't know why that has to be the conclusion. It's a leap, you know. There's something missing between, you know, external factors matter and we don't have UG. Why does that have to be the difference? Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, so the no, there is no critical period. Some learners do become native-like, right? This is inherently a challenge for claiming that there is a critical period, because then you have to explain why you have native-like learners, okay? Birdsong, here's the other birdsong, David Birdsong, right? That we talked about, I believe, in the native likeness section. Memory serves, yes. And then White and Genesee, Lydia White and Fred Genesee, both show some evidence of native likeness. That people have also claimed there is no clear cutoff point. They've plotted these sorts of like y-axis is your you know, your proficiency or your accuracy or whatever, and x-axis is age of arrival or age of acquisition, has been plotted several times. And over again, people say, well, it doesn't seem like a really specific drop-off point, right? The whole seems to be missing. In a lot of the times they try to plot this out, okay? So take a look at these hypothetical curves, and you'll see what I mean. If we imagine maturation, if we predict it to be at a particular age, so whether it's 13 or adult, we tend to treat it like it's 18. Keep in mind, we already have learned a language. So maybe our biology allows us to have access to stuff a little longer, and then at 18 it falls off. But like a lot of the places that claim for adults, they're really citing more like 18, which to me asks questions. Why 18? Why not 13 where everything else is? Anyway, but if we compare these hypothetical curves, right, with maturation, you could get lots of different things, right? You could get one where A's are really right at maturation, like lateralization, done, right? B, we could have a really short period where it's great and then it kind of declines over time over the maturational age, to which I ask you, is the critical period maturation? Is it a tiny period? Like, and then of course C is just from birth we naturally decline over time, period. That's the third option, right? And so people have argued that this maturational drop-off is just not shown in the curves. So for example, here we see data plotted from Flegge et al. Okay, this is phonology. So keep that in your back pocket here. It's phonology. And so they have plotted it once again. Native likeness is going to be up on the y-axis, so no foreign accent. Non-native likeness is down, strongest accent. And then left to right is age of arrival, which once again is being used as age of acquisition for L2. It's a very typical way to think about this. Blame Johnson and Newport because they were the ones that originally claimed that's what the predictor was. But you'll see here, this is not a specific drop-off point. It starts at birth and just goes. What is the critical period? Is it 9 months? Is that what it is? I mean, if that is it, it's very, very short. Okay. I mean, Flegge et al. Was trying to argue that you can't be native-like in phonology L2 based on this kind of data. This is Flegge's purpose, but it really asks the question, you know, are we talking about an extended period and then we lose it, kind of like it seems to happen with, you know, with L1? Or are we talking about the general decline? And again, phonology is a different beast in a way, because there does seem to be more of a linear relationship where you go, I'm really, really native. Actually, although phonology, funny, not related to this section at all. There's been some studies as a relationship with the size and just, you know, the articulation of your hippocampus and your ability to pick up accents later, but that's a whole different story. So for most people, this is the case. So right, according to Birdsong, David Birdsong, who's been writing about this for like 20 years now, this curve to the right is not evidence of a critical period because there's no drop-off. It's evident, unless you want to say it's the 9 months at the beginning, which he's not really considering, which that's a different criticism of him in this case. Okay, alternative explanations to drop-offs, okay? Generalized linear ones, for example, or curvilinear ones. So anything besides, right? All like the just like whoosh, or the curvy ones, right? So the other kinds of declines that aren't specific drop-off points. Hurst and Schoen, for example, suggested that we always have access to the same mechanism. So in this case, we could say UG, but we lack mental robustness. Our brains are just not as nubile as they once were. And so over time, it just takes us more effort to use them. That's a potential explanation for declines that are not specifically critical period, right? Now, let's get back to position 3. All right, so position 3, if you recall, was there's a critical period for some aspects of language, and I'm hinting that phonology is a candidate. 9 months or what? That there is one, right? So language is what we call modular, okay? It has various modules. And now a module, just so that we're on the same page, is like an aspect in the sense of syntax is a module, phonology is a module, morphology is a module, semantics is a module, right? The pieces that go together, modular, okay? So because language is modular, it has these different chunks kind of functions, it is logically possible for some aspects of critical period, not others. So some specific modules might have it, right? Such as morphology, pragmatics, and if we discussed a couple weeks ago, I believe pragmatics are a tricky place, right, to become native-like, so that's another candidate. Pragmatics, again, is meaning in context. Phonology, obviously, as we've said. Some ways that people propose this could happen is that principles are always accessible, but parameters are unable to be reset, right? So this isn't specific about modularity so much as aspects within those modules. So these are various different ways, some aspects and not others, right? Okay, so just keep this in mind. And the authors don't say a lot about this, unfortunately. And part of that's because it would be very difficult, short of going through and looking at the studies that test different pieces of the modules, to tease these things out. There's other ways to go about it that our authors haven't, and I'm not going to introduce them right now to complicate your life. But I will point out that a lot of the studies that say there is or isn't a critical period, for example, are mixing morphology and syntax. And there's an argument to be made that those things are different, right? Our authors, what they say, and I'll tell you what I think in a second. Our authors say that the strong version with the is untenable, okay? There is no clear cutoff point as far as we can see. A weak version is possible where we get some kind of slow but constant decline. It could be a curve, maybe even something linear, but that it does affect parts of language differentially, right? So people have an easier time becoming native-like in syntax than they are in pragmatics, for example, or than in phonology, some people also struggle, right? And so it looks like our authors are somewhere between positions 2 and 3. And I am too, honestly. And this piece here about things being different is important. I want you to think back for just a second about native likeness. And I want you to think for a second about Donald Ardiere's case study, right? And that particular person, if you recall, was able to become native-like in some aspects, but not in others. That's not a one-time event, right? The fact that that particular person mastered certain pieces of syntax, but struggled with morphology and didn't quite get phonology, or this is pretty common, right? That some things are mastered much earlier than others, and some things seem to be never mastered at all. And so my sense on this is also, at the very least, native likeness is, thing by, module by module, it's distinctive. Potentially phonology might have a critical period, but again, it's very short, right? I disagree with Birdsong that we see nothing. It's just it's hard to test them before 9 months. 9 months was not on his chart, right? And so potentially there's no critical period for straight up syntax, but there is potentially for phonology. There's definitely something going on for pragmatics. There is an alternative explanation to this that has to do with interfaces. If you know what that is and would like to know more about it, come and see me. I generally talk a little bit about this in Linguistics 423. So if you're going to take 423, I'll come back to it then. So there's no rush either. But there are more complex explanations about this that aren't as simple of critical or no critical. But yeah, I'm kind of somewhere between positions 2 and 3. I tend to say I think that I don't think there is one, because distinguishing out phonology is a very specific piece, because it has a lot of like physical characteristics to it. It's more than just a language component, it's literally physical. But yeah, there's more to that story. You're only responsible for what we talk about. If it's physically in this PowerPoint or if it's in the book, you're responsible for it. But other than that, you're not. So I'm not going to get too far off on tangent. Okay, so position 1, there is one. Position 2, there isn't one. Position 3, sorta. That's usually how this book goes, okay? If you have questions, send them to me, and I'll see you